Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, today we're heading all the way up to the top of the world. And, you really got to forget that old myth of a static, distant, completely unyielding expanse of ice, because the Arctic is rapidly thawing. And in the process, it's transforming into the ultimate front line of human history and global geopolitics. It's a pretty provocative question, isn't it? What actually happens when a supposedly mythical, totally frozen wasteland suddenly just begins to thaw? It's literally the core tension we're looking at today. We're talking about a region undergoing a metamorphosis that will reshape global trade, international security, and frankly, the biological balance of our entire planet. Because the top of the world is waking up. The ice is melting, these ancient waterways are opening right up, and humanity, well, we're rushing north. To truly grasp the sheer magnitude of this shift, we need to understand how we've historically viewed this space, the harsh physical realities of the environment, and the massive geopolitical scramble that's happening right now beneath the ice.
So let's get into Section 1, Myths of the Frozen North.
There's just this absolutely massive contrast in how people have historically looked at this place. I mean, the ancient Greeks, they actually envisioned a land called Hyperborea. Think an idyllic, tropical paradise full of giants sitting right beyond the north wind. But obviously, for the indigenous cultures actually living there, the reality was brutally different. To the Inuit, the Arctic was this incredibly harsh environment governed by powerful spirits and avenging monsters, like the Tupilak, which shamans would actually summon through these dangerous rituals. And for the Sami people over in northern Scandinavia, survival was all about this really intrinsic, deep spiritual bond between man and nature. So yeah, the true Arctic was never some tropical paradise. It was intensely rugged and deeply spiritual. All right, moving on to Section 2, Earth's smallest, coldest ocean. Now, despite the massive, outsized geopolitical weight it carries today, the Arctic is actually the Earth's smallest ocean. It covers just under 3% of the planet's surface. That's about 14 million square kilometers, or roughly the size of Antarctica. And it's also nearly landlocked, totally hemmed in by Eurasia, North America, and Greenland. That makes it an incredibly unique, isolated, and kind of claustrophobic marine environment, if you think about it. And that brings us to the fascinating mechanism that actually keeps this whole ocean frozen. It's called the polar halocline. Basically, it's this absolutely crucial layer of cold water with really steep salinity gradients. You can think of it like a vital, invisible shield. It literally separates the low salinity, freezing surface water and sea ice from the much warmer, high salinity, deep Atlantic waters down below. Without this polar halocline acting as a buffer, the heat from the deep ocean would just melt the surface ice completely. So this invisible shield ends up creating a really stark biological divide. The central deep basin is, for all intents and purposes, a biological desert, mostly because that multi-year ice just blocks out the sun. But if you move out to the marginal seas, places like the Barents and Chukchi, the waters are dramatically more productive. Fed by these nutrient-rich Pacific and warm Atlantic inflows, those edges are just teeming with life. We're talking massive fish populations, seals, and a huge variety of whales.
Which leads us to Section 3, the race to explore.
This human drive to conquer the Arctic actually stretches way back to 325 BC, when the Greek sailor Pytheas hit this terrifying frozen barrier that he described as a curdled sea. Fast forward a few centuries, and you've got Viking outlaws like Eric the Red pushing into Greenland, while Russian coastal dwellers, the Pomars, were aggressively charting early trade routes straight through the ice. But this centuries-old struggle culminated in a really dramatic way, in August 2007. That's when a modern Russian expedition actually used submersibles to drop a titanium flag directly onto the seabed, right at the North Pole. And that takes us right into Section 4, Russia's Arctic ambitions. Because that 2007 expedition, it really signaled a massive, multi-pronged expansion by Russia in the Arctic. They've established the Northern Fleet Joint Strategic Command, deploying submarines and missile cruisers to these newly reopened Cold War-era bases. Plus, they are the only country currently operating a full fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers. They're using that unique capability to fiercely expand offshore oil and gas extraction and essentially dominate the shipping lanes that are newly opening up. And the crucial point here is exactly why they're doing all of this. Well, it's about global trade. The Northern Sea Route, which runs right along Russia's northern coast, literally cuts the shipping distance between Europe and Asia by a third compared to the traditional route down through the Suez Canal. As the ice melts, this route stays open way longer. So it's essentially turning the Russian Arctic coast into a potential superhighway for global commerce. As you might guess, the geopolitical friction here is totally palpable. When international leaders criticized that 2007 titanium flag as a legal land grab, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov defended it as a scientific mission, one meant to prove the Lomonosov Ridge is actually part of Russia's continental shelf. He said, "The purpose of the expedition is not to stake whatever rights of Russia, but to prove that our shelf extends to the North Pole. By the way, the flag on the moon, it was the same." It's a pretty powerful comparison, right? It really highlights the incredibly high stakes of this new frontier. But, of course, this relentless economic push is facing some really intense resistance. Environmental groups are actively battling these developments. Greenpeace, for instance, strongly opposes offshore drilling. They argue that this pristine, highly fragile ecosystem just can't withstand the severe damage of industrialization. Even more alarming to these groups is the assertion that there are simply no viable safety plans to contain or clean up a catastrophic oil spill underneath shifting Arctic ice. And this clash actually escalated dramatically back in 2013 when the Russian Coast Guard seized a Greenpeace vessel, the Arctic Sunrise, during a protest at a Gazprom platform.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the climate tipping point.
Look, beneath all this tension is a truly staggering treasure trove. Geological surveys estimate the Arctic holds about 10% of the entire world's petroleum resources. That includes roughly 90 billion barrels of untapped oil, right alongside massive reserves of natural gas. It is just this vast energy frontier waiting to be claimed, which is exactly what's driving this relentless push north by both nations and megacorporations. But getting to those resources comes at a pretty terrifying planetary cost. The Arctic is warming nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the globe. That highly reflective sea ice, which normally bounces sunlight right back out into space, is disappearing. And as it melts, the newly exposed dark ocean absorbs way more heat, which in turn just melts more ice. It's a devastating, rapidly accelerating feedback loop. So that mythical frozen wasteland we talked about earlier, it is fundamentally collapsing, and we are fast approaching a critical tipping point. Scientists now predict that the Arctic Ocean could be entirely ice-free in the summer by the year 2040. The ramifications of that for global weather patterns, sea level rise, and marine ecosystems are almost impossible to overstate. All of this brings us to one final thought. As the ice retreats and the top of the world truly opens up, we really have to ask ourselves, is the melting Arctic the ultimate economic frontier, an unprecedented opportunity for global trade and energy? Or are we simply accelerating an environmental catastrophe that's just waiting to happen? The decisions being made in the freezing waters of the Arctic today are absolutely going to shape the future of our entire planet tomorrow. Keep questioning, keep learning, and hey, thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.